I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The Face of Imperialism by Michael Parenti. Oh, excuse me. I thought I was doing the intro. Okay, you can do it.
Wait.
Oh, wait, I'm confused.
confused. All right, you just do it.
Okay, sounds good. Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The Face of Imperialism by Michael Parenti, Paradigm Publishers, 2011. The key idea of this text is that despite pretending imperialism no longer exists, or pretending its existence is benevolent or altruistic, the truth is that the U.S. is
an evil empire.
Evil empire. Evil empire.
In that, U.S. imperialist policy seeks to destroy the autonomy of the nations of the world and bring them under neo-colonial control. That dominant investor interests in one country bring to bear military and financial power upon another country in order to expropriate the land, labor, capital, natural resources, commerce, and markets of that other country.
That national security state, its function is to make the world safe for the Fortune 500 and for the people in Group A.
Let's take a look at the text in depth. Chapter 1. Thinking about Empire. This chapter is about the discourse around empire and foreign policy. First, Parenti explains that what is considered objectivity is often just the dominant or orthodox opinion, limiting the understandable discourse. For example, he states, "Many of our political perceptions are shaped by culturally prefigured templates implanted in our minds without conscious awareness. To become critically aware of these ingrained opinions and images is not only an act of self-education, it is an act of self-defense." An example of a dominant or orthodox opinion might be the general public's opinion that the U.S. is generally a force for good in the world. Defeating tyranny in the Revolutionary War, defeating slavery in the Civil War, defeating the Nazis in World War II, fighting communism in Southeast Asia, and now fighting terrorism in the Middle East. Parenti continues, "The heterodox view has a special task to contest the prevailing orthodoxy, to broaden the boundaries of debate, to wake people up, to unearth suppressed data." Parenti takes this stance to explain that the U.S.'s role as an empire is kept outside the realm of acceptable discourse. So, for example, if I wanted to argue against the claim that the U.S. is generally a force for good in the world, I might mention the fact that the U.S. has sponsored torture in over 20 countries, or that the U.S. has bombed over 30 countries since World War II, none of whom attacked the U.S. In fact, here, I've shown this before, but I do recommend making a little map like this for yourself. It really gives a good scope of U.S. interventionism abroad, and it's a great conversation piece when company comes over. Even with this said, however, the dominant narrative can find ways to defend itself. But in those countries, X, Y, and Z happened, supporting terrorism, tyrannical leaders, spreading communism or whatever, and so we had to do something. You see, those U.S. military actions were justified. Well, firstly, no. But also, did the thing the U.S. had to do need to be bombing? Bombing which kills innocent civilians? Bombing countries which never invaded the U.S.? Or what about the use of torture? Surely you find these things objectionable. Well, Venezuela! Or, I mean, it's a crazy world out there. There are a lot of bad guys, some bad hombres, doing bad things. And well, would you prefer some bombing and torture of the baddest bad guys in the world? Or would you prefer the overthrow of Western society by terrorist Islamic cultural Marxism? What? Sometimes I don't even know where to start with you. Listen, what you're saying is patently false, and the rest of the text will clearly demonstrate this, so let's continue. Next, Parenti defines imperialism, stating, "By imperialism, I do not mean just power and dominion. I mean the process of transnational investment and capital accumulation." For those familiar with imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, this is certainly getting into the capitalist monopoly imperialism type stuff. Parenti argues that according to the dominant narrative, you're not supposed to look at empire or imperialism in this way. Rather, when you see the grave injustices, you're supposed to conclude that the U.S. is misguided, bumbling, reckless, driven by false assumptions, etc. That's what I was trying to explain to you! Parenti then further defines imperialism. He states, "In this book, imperialism is defined as follows: the process whereby the dominant investor interests in one country bring to bear military and financial power upon another country in order to expropriate the land, labor, capital, natural resources, commerce, and markets of that other country." Hey, it's your turn.
Oh, is it my turn? Okay, all right. Well, oh yeah. Chapter 2, The Omnipresent Arsenal. In this chapter, Michael Parenti argues why the American empire requires immense quantities of military might. Quote, "An empire finds its birth, growth, and perhaps even its eventual death in its force majeure, its irresistible armed power. Born of its own aggrandizement, an empire lives in a world of real or imagined enemies who must be subdued with force and violence." From the perspective of the U.S. empire, or the current imperial nation, there only exists two kinds of nations beyond its borders: satellites or vassals, and then there are enemies, potential and actual. Parenti defines the satellite state as a vassal state bonded to the Imperium. Parenti also defines the enemy state. Among the enemies is any country that seeks to chart an independent and self-defining course, to use its land, natural resources, capital, labor, and markets for its own development and possibly for regional hegemony. Michael Parenti gives two main reasons why the US requires such a large omnipresent arsenal even in the absence of a comparable opponent. 1. Keeping the world safe for global capital accumulation requires a massive military establishment. And 2. A massive military itself constitutes a source of immense capital accumulation. Parenti explains the class exploitation of the empire's arsenal. The empire feeds off the republic. The people who pay the cost of empire are not the same as those who reap its rewards. The gains of empire flow into the hands of the privileged business class, the large overseas investors, while the costs are extracted from the general treasury, that is, from the industry of the rest of the people.
Chapter 3, Why Rulers Seek Global Dominion. This chapter looks at what policies get a given country US support and what kinds of policies receive US repression. Parenti starts the chapter explaining how government and corporate power supports imperialism. He then states, "These US leaders have consistently supported rightist regimes and organizations and opposed leftist ones." Parenti then lists right-wing, capitalist, abusive, oppressive regimes that the US has supported, such as Pinochet in Chile, Batista in Cuba, Somoza in Nicaragua, and the Renamo in Mozambique, and the Contras in Nicaragua, etc., etc. Parenti then argues, when trying to determine the intentions of policymakers, we should look not only at whom they support, but whom they attack. US rulers have targeted just about all leftist governments, parties, leaders, political movements, and popular insurgencies. That is, any political entity that attempts to initiate equitable reforms, egalitarian programs for the common people, restraints on corporate capital, and self-development of their own countries. Parenti explains, methods of domination employed by the US Imperium to subvert and defeat reformist and leftist governments are as varied and ruthless as the opportunities of intervention may allow. And he names these methods: bribes, collusion, secret prisons, destroying protest groups, mercenary armies, financial divisions, propagating propaganda, sabotage, rigged elections, imposing embargoes, etc., etc., etc. Comrade Will, wake up!
Okay, I'm on. All right, chapter 4. Deliberate design. This chapter argues that empire, and thus imperialism, is not a coincidence, accident, or some sort of misleadership, as most liberals would conclude, but rather the goal of global hegemony is a planned and deliberate mission of imperialists. Parenti concludes the chapter with, in short, U.S. political corporate elites have long struggled to make the world safe for transnational capital accumulation, to attain control of the markets, lands, natural resources, and cheap labor of all countries, and to prevent the emergence of revolutionary, socialist, populist, and even nationalist regimes that refuse to submit to this arrangement. To achieve global hegemony, a global military machine is essential. The goal is to create a world populated by vassals, known also as client states, and compliant populations completely open to transnational corporate penetration on terms that are completely favorable to the transnationals. It is not too much to conclude that such a policy is produced not by dumb coincidence, but by conscious effort and deliberate design.
Chapter 5: How Moneyed Interests Create Poor Nations. This chapter is about the function of the parasitic relationship that is the First World's exploitation of the Third World. Right off the bat, Parenti makes this argument. How is it that as transnational corporate investments and trade with poor countries and international aid and loans to these same countries have all increased dramatically over the past half century, so has world poverty? Now you may be thinking that capitalism lifts people out of poverty and that people in the third world countries are getting richer, but this isn't the case. The YouTube channel Hakim covers this subject very well in this video. Let's have a look.
Some economists even go further and advocate an international poverty line of $5 or even $10, which is the upper boundary suggested by the World Bank. At this level, at this standard, we see that some 5.1 billion people, nearly 80% of the world's population, would be living in poverty or are living in poverty as of 2014. This number has only risen since then. There is evidence to show that pretty much any improvement has happened in China and only in China, with other regions in the world either staying as poor as they were 30 years ago or getting much, much worse.
Parenti then explains that third world countries are not underdeveloped, but in fact overexploited. This is because their current poverty is not their original condition. In fact, these countries were relatively rich, with relatively good standards of living, before they were exploited into poverty.
Underdevelopment, what's called underdevelopment, is a condition which is forcefully imposed on these countries through history.
This reality has several historical examples: the kingdoms of Africa versus the dividing up of Africa by European powers, the industrial centers of India versus England's forced deindustrialization of India, the standard of living in Afghanistan versus US support for the Mujahideen, standard of living in Iraq versus US interventions in 1991 and 2003, etc., etc. See The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein for understanding how this process continues to exist and develop in our modern world. Explaining capitalist imperialism's functions in the world, Parenti states, by displacing people from their lands and robbing them of their self-sufficiency, corporations create labor markets overcrowded with desperate populations forced into shantytowns to toil for poverty wages, when they can get work, often in violation of the country's own minimum wage laws. Corporations do not outsource to far-off regions so that U.S. consumers can save money. They outsource in order to increase their margin of profit. We saw this drive for capitalism to keep standards of living low in foreign countries in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where Lenin stated, "As long as capitalism remains what it is, surplus capital will never be utilized for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country. For this would mean a decline in profits for the capitalists." Parenti continues, working hand in hand with these transnational investments are the foreign aid programs. U.S. aid to other countries subsidizes construction of the infrastructure needed by corporations, ports, highways, and refineries. And here we come to some of the largest changes in imperialism since Lenin's 1917 book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Parenti states, in 1944, the United Nations created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Voting power in both organizations is determined by a country's financial contributions. As the largest donor, the United States has a dominant voice. The World Bank and the IMF were supposed to assist nations in their development. What actually happens is another story. The World Bank will lend money to this or that country to finance a huge dam project that displaces thousands of families while providing cheap irrigation for export agriculture and cheap power for a private company.
We will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations.
And Parenti concludes, the function of overseas investments, loans, and aid is not to uplift the masses in other countries. There's no profit in that. It is to advance the imperial interests of the global capitalist accumulators, to help them take over the lands and local economy of third world peoples, monopolize their markets, depress their wages, indenture their labor with enormous debts, privatize their public service sector, and prevent these nations from emerging as trade competitors by depriving them of normal development.
Man, this book is so good.
Will, it's your turn.
All right, let's go. Chapter 6, Globalization for the Few. In this chapter, Parenti shows how free trade is at odds with public service, how free trade agreements have spread poverty faster than to create jobs and more prosperity for the people. Globalization diminishes the living standards of working people not only in the third world, but in major industrial countries as well. He exposes how these free trade agreements are not a natural development of globalization, and that they have been consciously planned by big business and its government minions over a period of years in pursuit of a totally deregulated world economy that undermines all democratic checks on business practices. He also talks about how democratic sovereignty itself is being surrendered to a secretive plutocratic trade organization that presumes to exercise a power greater than that of the people and their courts and legislatures. Part of the process of globalization is to place the transnational corporation above sovereign power of any particular nation, while at the same time being served by the sovereign powers of all nations. Through the process of globalization, this is accomplished by promoting the idea of so-called free trade. Some more commonly known agreements might be the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. These agreements empower anonymous international trade committees such as the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, with the authority to overrule any nation-state laws that are deemed a burden to the investment opportunities of transnational corporations. Parenti explains the basic capitalist perspective of globalization. In early times, there were only village markets. These eventually expanded into regional markets, then national ones, then international ones, and now, finally, global agreements that cover the entire world. Globalization is presented to the public as a means to create jobs and prosperity by abolishing restrictive regulatory laws and by integrating nation-state economies into a more open and active trade system. In fact, these free trade arrangements represent a kind of coup d'etat by the giant business interests of the world. What is called free trade is neither free nor really about trade as such. Free trade is certainly not fair trade. It benefits strong nations at the expense of weaker ones, and rich interests at the expense of the rest of us, circumventing what little democratic sovereignty we have been able to achieve. Free trade elevates property rights above every other right among the nations of the world.
Chapter 7, Free Market Servitude. This chapter is about what it's like for a debtor nation exploited by the US. To start, Parenti explains, in the free market society of a third world country like Honduras or Indonesia, the peon is little more than a slave. His or her life is of no value apart from its capacity to create value for the owner through hard work at a subsistence wage. That is what the free market is about. the freedom of plutocrats to do whatever they want to those in economic servitude whose lives have become expendable and easily replaceable. Or as Vandana Shiva put it,
and yet even Indian peasants who believe in the next life are committing suicide because debt has become so unpayable in the new context. They used to have debt earlier, but it used to be the kind of debt they knew they could pay off with a little hard work. They could pay off with going off into the city for a migratory job and coming back. The debt today is so high. It's 200,000 rupees, 300,000 rupees for peasants who have no capital. And they know within a year or two, when they accumulate that kind of debt, they'll never be able to pay back.
Parenti then explains what neoliberals want to do in other nations, namely selling off public services and property to private investors, deregulating the economy, and opening up the country to foreign investment.
Now, why would U.S. policymakers, you really think U.S. policymakers are motivated by some need to abolish the social programs, the public sector services in Yugoslavia? Why would they want to do that? Do you think they are such nefarious, evil-intended individuals they would want to abolish their social programs? Come on, Parenti. Are you being paranoid? Well, why would they want to abolish our social programs? As they have been doing.
And Parenti concludes, when next you hear individuals singing the praises of the free market, remind them that the market is free only for the global empire's moneyed patrons. And this brings us to
Chapter 8, Target Cuba. In this chapter, Parenti uses Cuba as an example of a nation who has both withstood and resisted the aggression of the U.S. imperial empire. The empire justifies its aggression with a familiar mantra. Cuba is a communist regime, a threat to our freedom and an oppression to its own people. Therefore, we must strive for regime change. Parenti lays out cleverly the U.S. modus operandi, or methods and strategies, used by the empire to achieve regime change, which can be applied to any other country besides Cuba. These are important to note. Heap criticism on the targeted government for imprisoning the oppressors and assassins of the previous US-backed reactionary free market regime. Denounce the newly installed revolutionary or reformist government as dictatorial for failing to immediately institute Western-style politics or for showing friendly relations and trading with the then Soviet Union. Demonize the revolutionary leaders, labeling them as fanatical, brutal, genocidal, power-hungry, and even mentally imbalanced. Accuse the targeted country of posing a threat to regional peace and stability. Impose economic sanctions to cripple and destabilize its economy. Do whatever possible to make the economy scream. Give aid and money to subversive elements within the country. When the targeted government responds with angry criticisms about U.S. aggression, treat such charges as evidence of hostility towards America. Deny harboring any aggressive designs. Justify U.S. actions as defensive measures against terrorism or communist aggrandizements or both. Attack the country with surrogate mercenary forces, trained, equipped, and financed by the U.S. national security state, or, if necessary, with regular U.S. armed forces.
Chapter 9, Satellites or Enemies. This chapter is about explaining the two types of nations that exist in global imperialism. They are, of course, complicit exploited satellites or enemies. Parenti's key argument here is this. The face of imperialism today is of an American empire reaching into every corner of the world, served by cooperative allies and other satellite nations, an empire whose transnational corporations control the markets, investments, and resources of entire regions, accumulating hundreds of billions of dollars in yearly profits.
That national security state, its function is to make the world safe for the Fortune 500 and for the people in Group A.
Parenti continues, enemies are forever conjured to stir fear in the hearts of the American people so that they might continue to support a U.S. Imperium that bleeds the Republic in order to rule the planet. But the U.S. is a force for democracy in the world. For example, after overthrowing Iraq's democracy and installing Saddam Hussein, and then giving him weapons and funds to attack his people, and then overthrowing Saddam and installing Paul Bremer to make dictatorial decisions for the country, and then installing Bremer's hand-picked Iraqi government, the U.S. brought democracy to Iraq. Mission accomplished. Well, it is important to look at this question of democracy. Here's what Parenti has to say about it. U.S. rulers find electoral democracy useful when it helps destabilize one-party socialism or derail a reformist movement, or when it serves as a legitimating cloak for capitalist restoration. But when democracy starts to successfully advance egalitarian economic reforms, when it becomes a barrier to an untrammeled capitalism, then it must be undone or diluted in some way. In fact, Parenti addresses the Iraq example and the false reasons for the 2003 invasion. Iraq supporting Al-Qaeda? Not true. Weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. War crimes? Sure, plenty, but that was when the US was providing Iraq with money and resources for creating chemical weapons. Parenti then explains that the CIA helped overthrow progressive movements in Iraq in the 1950s, and then the Gulf War invasion in the 1990s, and the US bombing of Iraq for over a decade after that. Parenti then addresses North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. It's important to understand these arguments. Certainly Parenti has a sort of Marxist-Leninist style anti-imperialism to his stance, where because the US invasions are about destroying something positive in another nation, then the other nation has positive aspects awaiting destruction. Now, I'm not currently, nor have I ever been to North Korea, Iran, or Venezuela, but I do imagine, if you can believe it, that these countries are not horrible hellholes where death is the only solace from utter misery. But at the same time, these places aren't perfect. A little nuance, imagine that. And so it's important to note some of the positive elements of these countries that the US has often stood in opposition against, both at home and abroad, because it often turns out the US foreign policy will justify its actions in response to a country's negative qualities as an excuse to get rid of its positive qualities. Here's what Parenti has to say. Korea. Less publicized in the US media were North Korea's repeated overtures dating from the early 1990s for a bilateral non-aggression pact with the United States, all rejected by Washington. Parenti continues. After years of encirclement and demonization by Washington, the Pyongyang leaders were convinced that the best way to deter superpower aggression was by developing a nuclear arsenal. It does not really sound so crazy. Having been pushed to the brink for so long, the North Koreans by 2010 were taking a gamble, pursuing an arguably sane deterrence policy in an otherwise insane world configured by a voracious empire. Iran. Iran had other traits akin to pre-invasion Iraq: a high literacy rate, a better than usual third world living standard, a recycling of some of the oil profits into the social wage, and a leadership that was charting an independent course. And, as we might expect, Iranian President Mohammad Ahmadinejad was diagnosed by US media pundits as dangerously unstable and crazy. Venezuela. Not long after being elected president of Venezuela in 1998, Hugo Chavez was being denounced as a dictator and a threat to American interests. Here are some of the measures taken by the Chavez government. Parenti names quite a few things: land reform to assist small and poor farmers, environmental protections and restoration policies, increased access to education, a more equitable federal banking system, increased access to medical services, etc., etc. Parenti explains that the US funded millions of dollars into media manipulation in Venezuela. Now, obviously Venezuela has changed a lot since this was written in 2011. Venezuela is now obviously a terrible place where people eat rats.
For example, you know Venezuela, right? A majority of the country is currently eating rats.
Eating rats. Eating rats.
And it's also a complete embodiment of all socialist theories. Okay, well that's not true. If you want to know more about Venezuela, I recommend these videos. Now, these things are important to understand, especially as the current administration is eager to work with Brazil in regards to Venezuela. Yes, Brazil, who recently elected a right-wing fascist sympathizer president who praises Brazil's right-wing dictatorship period. So anticipate US action in Venezuela, either through direct invasion or through supporting an invasion. Regardless, the US working with a right-wing reactionary government, like Brazil, to overthrow a left-wing government, such as Venezuela, is exactly the kind of thing this text is all about. And finally,
Chapter 10, Rogue Imperium. Here, Parenti reaffirms that the overall aim of U.S. rulers is to promote a global order dedicated to private ownership of the world's financial and industrial wealth, expropriation of its natural resources, and advantageous control of its consumer and labor markets. This is a world where the gap between the wealthy few and the many poor grows ever greater, where the masses are experiencing a drastic decline in living standards. He also reaffirms his position against liberals, where U.S. global policy has been ruthlessly rational. The Imperium is ruled not by fools, but by liars, manipulators, murderers, and other criminals, all of whom tend to believe in their own virtue. The imperial state often functions accountable to no one. Parenti distinguishes between imperial diplomacy and traditional diplomacy, defining traditional diplomacy as the process of settling disputes by looking for workable compromises, finding solutions that might leave both sides less than completely satisfied, but satisfied enough to avoid armed conflict. And he defines imperial diplomacy as usually begins with a set of demands that is implicitly treated as a non-negotiable, even if presented as proposals. If the other side is resistant to the proposal, then Washington denounces them as uncooperative. If concessions are made by the weaker nation, the empire then escalates its demands. In addition, Parenti notes that imperial diplomacy is inclined to ignore treaties and international law, accepting only the limitations imposed by self-interest and power. Parenti brings up the idea of a collapsing empire and how many writers, historians, political scientists, and others predict a collapse upon the horizon. But Parenti urges that we should not underestimate the empire's capacity for durability and regeneration. Despite losing the Vietnam War, U.S. imperialism became stronger in the years that followed. He says, an empire dedicated to boundless corporate plunder is unfortunately more likely to undo the global ecosphere before it undoes itself. Meaning, the U.S. plutocrats will sacrifice everyone and everything before giving up its power. This book ends with addressing the reality of the current situation. Reality is a problem for the ruling class. Reality has to be consistently finessed and misrepresented because reality is radical. The empire is only as secure as the lies it can sell. By becoming aware of this, we have a better chance of moving against the tide and resisting the deadening hand of free market plutocracy. A better chance of exposing the dominant imperial paradigm for the suffocating, dirty little box that it really is. A better chance to build a real and viable democracy amid a family of nations in a peaceful and sustainable world.
Conclusion. As we've seen, this text is similar to Vladimir Lenin's 1917 text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Yet, where Lenin's text is much more theoretical and about addressing a newly developing phenomenon and analyzing its methods, structures, and motivations, Michael Parenti's The Face of Imperialism is much more matter-of-fact, being that this text is from 2011 and has come long after World War I and World War II and the Dirty War period and Cold War interventionism and the fall of the Soviet Union and the creation of global controlling institutions such as NATO and NAFTA and the IMF and the World Bank and the development of over 1,000 US military bases all over the globe, we can see, in the face of imperialism, how Lenin's theories and predictions have come true to violent, horrific results. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewers. Thanks for watching.